Good evening, everybody. My name is Shannon Fleck. I'm the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Faith Network, and we're here this evening for a wonderful panel discussion on legislative advocacy, specifically from a faith lens. So that's our conversation tonight. We have some amazing panelists joining me. And I told them before we began that I have anxiety about introducing people now because I'm so terrified that I'm going to mess it up in some way. So I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves so that you can get to know them a little bit before we get going. And we're going to go ahead and start with Jayshana. You have to unmute though. You're good.
Started off on the right foot, right? Thank you so much. First, once again, I just want to say thank you for sharing this space, and I look forward to such a great conversation. Jayshana Smith, I currently work for the Groundwork Project as the program officer, and just recently started in that role back in August of 23 after over 20 years in the oil and gas business. And I knew that I was brought here to serve the people, and I finally had an opportunity to find that space to really jump into that, which in turn allowed me to find out about Julius Jones and the Julius Jones Coalition. And then within that, I was able to become really involved in advocacy work and became a member of the Julius Jones leadership team. And then from that, I am now the program director for the Julius Jones Institute. And then I also have my own nonprofit called the H.O.P.E Foundation, where we do a lot of mutual aid. We work with a lot of house citizens and providing support there. And we just do a lot in the community. And I have 4 amazing young men that will have two of them will have birthdays this week. So my oldest will be 25 and my youngest will be 18. So excited about that, and just love doing. I always say we're the salt of the earth, and I believe a lot of my gratitude comes from being able to just serve the people. So thank you for having me.
Jayshana, you are not busy at all then. You have nothing at all keeping you busy.
Nothing at all. So much free time.
Wow. Well, we appreciate it. Thank you. Senator Boren, if you wouldn't mind introducing us to yourself.
Hello, everyone. Is my sound okay? Good. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm State Senator Mary Boren from Norman, Oklahoma. I was raised Church of Christ, and I'm currently attending the First Christian Church and a member and a deacon at the First Christian Church in Norman, Oklahoma. So throughout my life, I have always had pretty intense biblical interaction, and it's a big part of my life. And because of my concern for justice, especially marginalized communities, but mainly children. My parents were house parents at a children's home in Southwest Oklahoma. It was a religious-based children's home. And my mother and father both had lost parents when they were children. It just exposed me to the needs of children without parents. And so when I finished law school, I always was very aware of child advocacy, and then also the framework of religious abuse, or when people in religious power fail or neglect to do what they're supposed to do to care for others, and even use their religious power in a very hurtful and manipulative way. So unfortunately, I was exposed to that a little bit sooner than probably most people are as a child. And it always kind of framed how I expressed my faith in public and what I expected of faith leaders, and then also in the political realm as well. So with that, as I ran for state senator, I've always been aware of how Oklahoma uniquely is vulnerable to religious authoritarianism. And because I have such a strong background in Bible study, I can more readily be familiar with how hypocritical and non-scriptural a lot of that framework is. So that has led me to, has called upon me sometimes to be ready to say and refute some of that stuff that I see at the state capitol in Oklahoma and then nationally as well. During COVID, I had a series of book talks. It was right after the George Floyd murders. One book talk I had was Reading While Black, and it's by Esau McCaulley. And then another one was The Color of Christ, and about how we came to see Jesus of the Bible as white and not Middle Eastern. And there was a guy that researched that, which was pretty interesting and disturbing at the same time. And then Dr. Samuel Perry is from the University of Oklahoma. And 2 years ago, I think, maybe 3, in that summer, he did a book talk on his book, Taking America Back for God. So with those 3 book talks, that kind of also kind of framed me within our caucus. The Democratic caucus is one to keep my caucus informed about Christian nationalism and Oklahomans' propensity for that, and to be prepared to try to help Oklahomans see that they can keep their faith and they can leave Christian nationalism behind.
Yes, Senator Boren, thank you so much. First of all, love Samuel Perry. Sensational. Can't recommend enough. And also can't wait to talk a little bit more about Christian nationalism in this space because it's a hot topic, especially now. So thank you very much. Dr. Walke.
Hi, friends. I am Reverend Dr. Lori Walke. I am a born and raised lifelong Oklahoman. And my parents raised my 3 sisters and I to know 2 things. 1, we would be in church every time the doors were open. And 2, we would go to college because they firmly believe that education was one of the ways that you can get to where you need to be to fulfill and meet the needs of the world with your particular gifts and talents. Some people would say that I have taken both of those directives to the extreme, but here we are. I am indeed an unbridled enthusiast about what the beloved community can do to make life on earth as it is in heaven for all of our neighbors. I serve alongside the people of Mayflower Congregational United Church of Christ in Oklahoma City as their senior minister. And I am married to Colin Walke, who is an attorney and a former state representative. So we are always getting into some kind of trouble.
Good trouble, always. Good trouble. Thank you so much. We're an all-female panel tonight, which did not happen on purpose, but happy Women's History Month. Here we are, I literally we're all ladies. So I wanted to start just a little bit by anyone who's watching, unless you are actively involved and engaged with the legislative process, it can seem a little far off, maybe confusing. I certainly was highly confused when I first started trying to pay attention. And so I'm just going to give kind of a broad stroke overview. Right now, we are at the start-ish of the legislative session. It begins in February and usually wraps up with sign die at the end of May. Whoa, my kid's making noise. So we've just passed what is the first committee deadline. And what that means is when bills are proposed to either chamber, the House or the Senate, they are assigned to committees. And these committees decide by vote whether or not they want to proceed to the floor of the entire chamber. So that has to happen in the chamber with which it originated. If it's a House bill, it has to pass out of the committee, go to the House floor for a vote. If that House bill passes the House floor, it travels over to the Senate, where the Senate assigns it to a committee. And then it has to survive a Senate committee. And if it does survive a Senate committee, it goes to the Senate floor for a vote. And if all 4 things of those happen, it goes to the desk of the governor. There are some pathways that bills can take. and all sorts of things that can happen throughout that 4-step process, but that is the general mode. So when I say we just passed the first bill, the first committee deadline, what that means is that the deadline has passed for bills to be heard in the House of Origin Committee. Ugh. We see now why it gets so confusing. They have graphs. There are little maps that we can look up and see the journey. But the path that a bill takes to become law does go through steps. And it's important as advocates who are living, breathing, working in our communities to be aware of bills we like, bills we don't like, and be aware of where they are in the process. It's a lot easier to convince a committee to not pass a bill than it is to convince an entire chamber of people to not pass a bill, and vice versa, to pass a bill. So, with that being said and a framework set, let's jump into this, because faith is becoming a more and more active derivative of the political process. So, Senator Boren, I'd love to start with you. You touched on it already so beautifully. We've seen this evolution where now faith is being evoked regularly from our Senate and House chambers. What is that like as a legislator?
Well, first, I would push back a little bit about the use of the word faith. I think we see religion being used. I'm not that sure that faith is being used, except for broadly, like separation, where you have religious freedom to express your faith. We kind of see that. But for the most part, what we see right now is what started in the 1950s. What Nixon started, and where the National Prayer Breakfast, when that started, it was really an agenda for Christianity to be elevated to the same kind of a theocracy kind of level. So how do I see that happening? I think Samuel Perry's book, really, I've seen that, he talks about the 4 attributes of Christian nationalism. And some of y'all might have to help me with the bullet points, but one is borders, that you have real strong fences and borders. And we see bills pop up about territorial boundaries and defining territorial boundaries, and even fences between land and jurisdiction, just lots of boundary kind of talk. Also, there's always a good guy and a bad guy, or good guys versus bad guys, or real strong good and evil. And you'll see bills kind of are really framed in that predetermined groups of good and bad. You see that. I think, unfortunately, what Senator Woods had said about Nex and it's Owasso, right? And their death, I think that that's kind of consistent with there's evil and good, and
We got a little bit of a delay there. Let me move over to Lori while we troubleshoot that a little bit. Lori, what is it like as a faith leader? Yeah, you've been doing this for a while. You've likely observed a very long evolution happening. What is it like to, as a faith leader, do this?
Sure. I think one of the things that some folks have batted around is this idea of, well, if there's a religious right that's really trying to exert its will on everyone, why don't we counter with a religious left? And I have really emphasized to folks that one's primary identity should not be a partisan party. And we talk a lot in my congregation about the difference between politics and partisanship. Sometimes those words are used as synonyms. They are not, and I can launch into that later. But right now, what I am really focusing on as a faith leader is encouraging people to talk about their values and their shared values with others so they might find common ground. Faith is actually not a value, but you can talk about the importance or the role of faith in your perspective and your approach to living, but to help people start articulating their values so that we might build bridges towards one another, in the hopes that we do, in fact, actually mostly want the same things. We just have different ways of getting there. So that's my primary focus right now as a pastor.
Thank you. Thank you. Jasana, you have been on the ground doing advocacy in the midst of this state, as you discussed.
Yeah.
How have you utilized faith, and how have you seen that as a connecting point?
Well, I will say, I think Dr. Lori said it best. We have to find a common ground, and when we go into these spaces where we may potentially feel like there's not a common ground, I think the biggest thing is like, how do we get to the table together and begin that conversation? Progressive, conservative, whatever it may be, there's an attachment somewhere there's a commonality where this person has experienced something in the system and this person has experienced something, right? So how do we bring those together? So a lot of times for us, it is about gaining the trust of our neighbors, because I feel like when we look at the state of what our state is in, there's no trust, and then we go back to, well, we're the Bible Belt, right? Which goes back to what Senator Mary Boren was saying. That's religion, I feel like, is what is being pushed upon all of these things. So how do we, as people on the ground, get our community members to say that they trust us enough to build people power? Because once we start building that power, when we start doing this instead of this, then there's so much change that can happen, right? So part of our goal and what we do is we sit down and we have real conversations. We don't sugarcoat it. We allow people to talk. We don't just, a lot of what we do is voter registration, and we don't just see it as that. Like when we go into these high schools and colleges, we know this generation calls us out, and we use our faith in that manner to be able to say, thank you for opening this door for us to have a real conversation, but we don't push our faith, if that makes any sense. We just allow them the space to be themselves. We allow them the space to do peer-to-peer talking, but we're there to maybe help, well, let's think this way, or maybe we should go this direction, or what do you think? So I think for us, it really goes back to our faith keeps us grounded within our organization, but it also reminds us that we have the ability to be able to touch our neighbors to gain the trust that is needed to build power with our people.
Yeah, you gain that trust by showing, not telling, right? We show our neighbors how we love, and we show by continuing to behave in ways that are, most appropriate.
Yeah,
we
inspire.
There's a lot of diverse work that's gone into the Justice for Julius movement, and that folded in a lot of viewpoints, a lot of perspectives. How did that movement work to bring commonality across such a diverse movement?
I always hear Cece say there's room at the table for everyone. And one of the biggest things that she always teaches, well, I say teach because sitting at the feet of Cece Jones Davis, I've learned so much. But I mean, it goes back again, finding that common ground, finding the conservative that may believe in the death penalty, but understand and knows that this is an innocent man and he should not die. Does that make sense? And so conservative, progressive, whatever, what is the commonality that we need to come together to fight against something like that? And so I think it just goes back to being able to know, she said, know what room that you're in. Be able to understand and know who you're going to be talking to. Understand, don't go in with just guns blazing and like, no, I'm not going to hear what you have to say because this is what I believe. No, once again, what is it that we have in common that we can come together on to make change and difference?
Beautifully said. Thank you. Senator Boren, I want to, hopefully we got you back. I want to continue along this thread for people who are trying to connect with a legislator or a leader in our city government, local, that maybe we don't agree with on all fronts. And how do we approach a public official in a way that's not going to, throw the conversation off?
Well, can y'all hear me? Is this good? One, Claudia Swisher, y'all probably know her. She is very, very effective. One thing that she has done is she has over time read books with different legislators. So she just comes in and has a conversation and then leaves. And then, so she's been very consistent, I guess, over several years of doing that. So that's one. During my sister's graduation from Tufts, she got a master's in school psychology. This graduation speaker said it is questions that unite us and answers that divide us. And so I think that is a really good way to find common ground, is to agree on a problem. Maybe you don't know what the solution is, or you disagree on the solution, but you can agree that there's a particular, homelessness is not good. That's a problem. Not people that are homeless aren't problems, but the issue of not having homes for everyone to live in is a problem. Wouldn't you agree? And now it may not be the number one priority problem for a particular legislator, but for them to acknowledge with you that that is a problem is a really good way. And then you just say, what is the role, and ask, what is the role of government in solving this problem? What's the role of business? What's the role of local communities? And just kind of understand their perspective on how they see the role of different folks at the stakeholders in solving that problem. And then just kind of have that conversation about solutions that they're offering. And then if a lot of times with bans and criminalizing things, we have data and things that shows that that's not always the best solution. So that opens the pathway of comparing solutions versus trying to get them to buy into your solution. And if you look at data and evidence, or personal experience is also, I think, very powerful about, especially if it's a problem you care about, it's because of a story that you have to share about that and why that's a priority for you. So it may be you have a child with a disability, or you experienced, being in foster care and what that experience was like. I think the challenge, though, is to go from your personal story, which is anecdotal, to attributing that to a problem for the state, a policy problem for the state. And I think that's where you have to be very effective as an advocate to get them to see if they accept that is a problem and it should be a priority. I think that's two ways to start. I think where people get really tripped up is they get really focused on a bill and they're trying to get a particular solution through. And unless you have a large team lobbying for that, and that particular lobby group has a lot of political power in Oklahoma, then it becomes very hard to get a particular solution passed But if you're willing over time to build a relationship and a conversation around a particular policy issue, like mass incarceration or the death penalty or whatever, it's just, you have to be really just consistent about going up and having conversations regularly on that topic, and be willing to understand and listen to that particular legislator's perspective. And then also remember, they represent a constituency. So I think that's also very important to ask them, do your constituents agree with you on this? Or are you going off because God chose you to be the person to make the decision on this? And there are people up there that act that way. But I think that's very helpful too, to understand, do they see themselves as representing their constituents, or do they see themselves called by God to carry out some, agenda or policy narrative? And you need to know what you're dealing with. So I think that's all kind of how I see working with legislators.
Yes, thank you for that. It's always very important to be able to connect a personal narrative with the broader picture. And storytelling is important. I see Antoinette on the chat. Hi, Antoinette, saying that storytelling helps emphasize the importance of things. It helps to connect, but you as the advocate have to be able to also connect those dots for the public official. So do that brainstorming. This matters to me, and this is why it likely matters to the people you represent, which are many. Thank you.
Shannon, can I jump in here? And I just want to also add, of course, Senator Boren has named all of these, some really helpful things. And I think Deshauna has done that as well. The other thing that I think doesn't get brought up very often is a core organizing principle, which is that someone is not always an ally, and they are not always an enemy. There are things that you will never, ever agree on with a particular person, but you should always be looking for ways to be allies on other issues. Because once you establish that trust, that working relationship, then it opens up the possibilities more. There's more room for everyone to be generous in how they think. They know you better. We've been talking about relationships. But if we let ourselves characterize someone as always an enemy, simply because we don't agree on a particular issue, and it may be very serious disagreement, life or death disagreement, but if we can't find other ways to work together, then there's really not any room to change that get out from between the rock and the hard place.
Absolutely. At OFN, we very much keep the emphasis on people of faith and what is working for people of faith. And when we see the weaponizing of faith, that's usually when you'll see our presence in either way, no matter which way that cookie crumbles. And one of the ways we're working towards that right now is gaining the awareness in our state house that Oklahomans support the separation of church and state. Here in the state of Oklahoma, it's First Amendment right, First Amendment guarantee, and that amendment protects all religious expressions, and it protects all of us to live and work and practice our faith as we see, and that is integral to functioning in a religious faith. And we have seen bills coming and have seen bills in the past that threaten that separation. So I'm going to ask Kat to throw the link to our sign-on letter in our comment section, or post it up on the screen so you all, if you are watching, can go and participate in that letter to let your legislator know that you support keeping religion out of policy, which is highly important. And it doesn't matter what political party you are, it's an important stance to take for our democracy. Lori, I want to come back to you and have you elaborate a little bit more on partisanship versus politics, and kind of elaborate on what you were saying earlier.
Sure. This is, I think, a really important piece, especially for folks who were raised with the idea that you keep your elbows off the table and you keep your politics out of the pulpit and the pews. And I think, again, that approach really rests in a misunderstanding of the meaning of politics versus partisanship, and that distinguishing between the two is of vital importance. The explanation of politics in Urban Dictionary, if you're not familiar with Urban Dictionary, it's an online sort of alternative dictionary, but it gives us an idea of why politics in church is distasteful to so many people. It's a crowdsourced definition, and their definition of politics in Urban Dictionary is that it is derived from the root word poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking creatures. So many blood-sucking creatures is the definition of politics that people kind of have in their mind. And of course, the church should definitely not be involved in that. What people don't realize is that politics really means something very different. Yes, like Merriam-Webster defines it in some broader terms, like the art and science of gathering people, the art and science of building a society. But theologian Jim Wallis describes it as the shape or shaping of community. And theologian Marcus Borg really dives into this in one of his books, where he says that politics is the shaping of the city. And of course, politics comes from the Greek word polis, meaning of the city. And so politics is the shaping of large-scale communities, kingdoms, nations, empires, the world. And so in this sense, politics matters greatly. It has us ask questions like, who rules, in whose benefits? What is the economic system like? Is it fair, or is it skewed toward the rich? Is it hierarchical or patriarchal? Is it xenophobic? Is it homophobic? And if we as individuals abandon politics to just those who are in power, then we abandon it to the pharaohs and the Caesars, to use some reference to some biblical characters. We abandon the shaping of our communities to those folks. And we think that is decidedly unfaithful. We make an argument that we definitely should be engaged in politics. I'm going to speak as a Christian pastor because that is what I am. But we think that Jesus, certainly the Gospels have a politics, and we see that in Jesus's ministry. He would not shut up talking about the difference between the rich and the poor, the gap there. And those are some political statements, right? Those are related to economics. And so we think that politics is really vital. What we don't think is vital is partisanship. And I would define partisanship as behavior that harasses an enemy. And that's certainly not what people of faith should be engaged in. In part, and specifically for Christians, we are instructed, of course, that if we do have enemies, we are to pray for them. We are to bless those who we feel like are picking on us and persecuting us. And so partisanship is this division into teams where I think people of faith have this general understanding that we are all under this umbrella, all in the family of God. And if we are all in the family of God, we're all on the same team. So we can't, our primary identity is not Republican, it is not Democrat, it is not Libertarian, it is not Independent. It's not the Green Party. Our primary identity lies outside of that partisanship, where we are tempted to treat each other as enemies, where someone can win and lose, when really, again, we are all on the same team.
Can I say something to that? Like, faith dictates our values, right? And within that, when I think about leadership, when it comes from a faith perspective and the power that someone in that role that God has called that they have for the people, I think for me, because I've grown up around, don't talk about politics in the church. We're just not going to do that. But the thing is how are the people that you're leading that trust your voice going to ever understand and know how to fight for themselves? You know, it can't just be, we'll pray about it, or you pray for this person. No, how do we come together collectively and we fight together as a unity, and then we love our neighbor in the midst of doing that? You know what I'm saying? So for me, that's one of the things that when we're on the ground, the thing is like, yo, what can we do to get our faith leaders involved? Because they have the collective power to bring more people to the table, because those people trust the vision that God has given that leader, right? So that is one of the things that's been really hard for us, is how do we get more faith leaders involved? And how do we get our faith leaders to go into these communities that they are bringing the people from, to even understand the issues that are even happening? You know what I'm saying? So that's just, I'm with you, Dr. Lori.
Yes, and that was beautifully said, Jayshana, because, and Lori, we have to understand as faith leaders and also people of faith, not just the faith leaders, but people of faith, this primary difference between partisanship and politics. The gospel of Jesus, if you are Christian, is highly political. It is very political. What we experience in society right now is highly partisan. And for us as leaders and advocates and people who are working in faith spaces and utilizing our faith, we have to help connect that dot, right? We have to help our neighbors, our leaders, our families understand that there is a difference between speaking politically and speaking in a partisan way. I take criticism when I make public comment about issues that are reducing religious freedom for all people, that I'm being political. One of our leaders, and I quote, said, "I'm shocked that she's using her faith platform to be political." And my feeling was, yes, I am using this faith platform to ensure the religious freedom of all people in Oklahoma. And that is not a partisan thing. That is a political issue. It shouldn't be. But the difference is very nuanced at this point, because partisanship has gone so incredibly far in this country. So excellent points. Senator Boren, we do have a question in the chat that maybe you can help us with. Our friend Sue Hosh mentioned, and she does a lot of death penalty advocacy work here in Oklahoma. She had a representative that told her that he was in favor of the death penalty and that it didn't matter what his constituents felt. How does an advocate respond to a response like that from a political leader?
Well, I think, that's disappointing. I think if your issue is death penalty and they're not persuaded by what their constituents want or say, I think that it would be important. You have two pathways in that moment. One then is I would start connecting with his constituents who do care about that issue And if it's a House member, they get reelected every 2 years. So that's pretty good, because then you can have town halls on that issue, invite him or her to come listen and, bring constituents in to explain it. But that's very common in Oklahoma, that people can get elected without knocking doors, without talking to constituents about their priorities. So it's very common for elected officials to take that seat of power and think it was something that their ambition or their connections entitled them to have. And if they're extremely religious, they'll think, well, God picked me to be, called me, anointed me to be in this seat of power. So the accountability piece is to actually have that legislator actually talk to their constituents, which sometimes they can dodge. As far as on a death penalty situation where they don't value constituents, I would maybe be interested in hearing, do they think that it should be done fairly? If they do think that they do believe in the death penalty, find out, well, how important is it for you to make sure that you are executing guilty people and not innocent people? Does it bother you that Oklahoma has had 10 innocent people, or people that were on death row were declared innocent through evidence? How do you feel that we're at risk of executing an innocent person? And what policies do you support to prevent that? And kind of push it back on them, is like, because I think that's the other thing I've heard and read about the psychology of that black and white, all or nothing, winners, losers, good versus evil, is introducing gray. So you're in favor of the death penalty, but surely you don't want to execute innocent people, because wouldn't that undermine the whole value that you have in your mind of the benefit of the death penalty? Because if Oklahoma knows that we're executing innocent people, how does that impact its, whatever benefit that it is to discourage people from doing bad things, or this bad thing that you talked about? Also, do you think it's important that they have due process? And do you think it's important that they have legal representation? Or do you think that the legal representation that they have is inadequate, that they have too many cases? And do you seriously think that everybody has access to the same justice that's not based on wealth? Like, does everybody have the same access to a good attorney? Is that your experience? Have you ever had to hire an attorney to defend you against being wrongfully accused of anything? Has anybody in your family been wrongfully accused? Now, lawmakers have been wrongfully accused about things, because that's what happens. So just say, what if that was something that if they were right, it would warrant the death penalty? How supported do you think you were or would have been if you had to go get an attorney to clear your name? Do you have the resources to do that? So I think that's creating gray, because if they're categorically in favor of the death penalty is good, not having it's bad. I think creating gray is important. The other thing is just take their own value system with them. Okay, if they think it's okay, then say, well, don't you think people should live every breath of life that they can possibly live, so that they can come to know the Lord and spend eternity in heaven? Like, if you're shortening their life, I thought we were supposed to make disciples, not shorten their life. I mean, this is getting into real doctrinal, theological stuff,
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that being prepared for that, understanding that asking their theology around it and how they've worked through some of these. Who is it God's job to? I thought that every day is numbered by God.
Mm-hmm.
How are you stepping in to shorten the life of another person? And don't you want to be really sure that we're not, messing up on that? So that's kind of how I would. Then on the whole thing of the idea of we're in a representative democracy, I think it's okay to say, if somebody says, I don't care what my constituents say, I get what you're saying, but I just want you to know how concerning that is to me, that somebody would sit in power and disregard representative democracy.
Yes.
Do you understand how threatening that can be to somebody like this, to me, that has very little power?
Right.
To know that somebody doesn't care about representative democracy and the power of voters. Is that what you intended?
Yeah, I love that point. And I also wanted to highlight Cherie Dickerson in the chat, who commented, if a legislator responded in that manner, they are not a political leader. And I just want to second that. And also take the opportunity to say voting does matter. I think a lot of people here in Oklahoma just wash their hands of the political process and don't show up. When 40% or less of our state's population and the population of the US show up to vote, we end up in situations where we have political leaders who don't care, because they don't have to work to earn your vote. Especially when we start thinking about local elections, your vote matters huge. You are literally picking the person who is going to be that advocate for you in your local city, in your municipality, in your state house. Those elections are why we show up. Yes, this is a presidential election year, and a lot of people in Oklahoma are like, well, okay, ignore that then. Show up for the local leaders, because they are the ones that are affecting our laws and our lives. So my little plug there. Shauna?
No, I mean, but how do we use our faith to help them show up, right? How do we, and that faith comes by going out into the neighborhoods, meeting people right where they're at, listening to what they're saying. And the thing is, I think what's frustrating sometimes for us when we're organizing and whenever we are in these neighborhoods, in our neighborhoods and everywhere, is the fact that my vote doesn't matter. But the thing that has to be known is that it takes time to build that. It's like building a muscle, right? The more that you work it, the stronger it gets. So the more that you vote and you start understanding and having the knowledge, I think what's also happening is that we are not taking the time to gain the knowledge to understand what these offices are, local and state levels, that will help us get these policies changed that are causing us not to be able to live in a manner that we should have the opportunity to live. Does that make sense? And so our faith in being able to go out and say, okay, what can we show you, or how can we show you by our actions that this works? Like, this literally works by voting. Because even if you're not voting, one thing that Antoinette tells our young people, that's still not, you're still voting. Not voting, you're still voting. So like, find something that you care about, and think if that was taken away from you, that right was taken away from you, and then we think about faith. I think about Selma and how Dr. King, there was all faiths and walks of life that came together and locked arms and stood together. And did you see the power of change that happened when that happened? So we have we can see that's faith building right there by watching and knowing that our ancestors died. So many people, not just our Black ancestors, but women and men, went through so much for us to have that right. So now it's up to us. What do we do with it? How do us as the organizers and the faith leaders take the power that God has given us and be able to implement that into the community? Because faith comes by hearing, then write the vision, make it plain. So if there's no vision, the people will perish, right? So we have to cast that vision and inspire the people to come together, I think, when it comes to voting. And I think and hopefully we can build from there. It's like eating an elephant, as Pastor Marcus says.
Oh,
I want to.
I love that so much. And the faith and that visual from Selma, it really just, it shows that faith is more than just tradition. It's more than just doctrine. It's more than just Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist. There are roots that are grounded within us that connect to one another on this very fundamental level of values and coming together to move the needle. And when things come along that are trying to shove that needle back, we can unite together to progress that forward. Let me go to you, Lori. I see you, Senator Boren. I'm going to come right back to you here. How do we do better at rooting our faith into something that's more communal for action?
Rooting our faith in something. Say that one more time, Shannon.
Yeah, I'm such a visual person, so I like paint pictures in my mind. And so when Jayshana was talking, I was thinking about the roots. I was thinking about kneeling on a Selma bridge. I was thinking about linking arms, and that the process of this diverse community coming together is like rooting into the ground, like grabbing deep into the soil of ourselves. So that's very imagery. I'm hoping this description helps. How do we tap into that like rooted organic energy?
I think that this is a couple of things. Actually, when Jashana was talking, I was thinking just how important the things that all that she was talking about was about community. And I think perhaps this is a white Christian American problem in particular, is this obsession with the individual and my vote doesn't matter and I'm not being listened to, when really it should be who are we reaching out to? Who are we linking arms with? How are we building power? Shoshana also talked about that earlier. How are we building coalitions? How are we finding common ground? Intentionally putting ourselves in, decentering ourselves, and I am specifically talking to white Christian Americans here, decentering ourselves and listening. This takes a very specific commitment to theological humility, to the core value of I don't know what I don't know, and while I don't have to believe everything everyone else believes, I still have to practice the theological humility to say perhaps they're onto something. And that I think can start the conversation of what else do we have in common? What I think about was so great about connecting people, the name of the Oklahoma Faith Network itself says we already have this shared experience, this priority in our life of faith, of religion, of spiritual expression. Like we don't even have to find something to begin with. We've already have this in common. So, all right, now that we have that, now let's talk about the values that come out of your faith. What is it that how is your theological claims inspiring you to do the work that you want to do? So I think that again, it just all goes back to community and building those connections that Jashana was talking about.
Beautiful. Thank you. And thank you for writing my vision word. You know what I'm talking about. I see things, I speak them, and then people don't know what I'm talking about. So thank you for asking the follow-up, Lori. Senator Boren.
Yeah, so when Jashana was talking, I use this term moral agency, and it's a lot over in women in faith, that the hierarchy and that dominionistic of there's God and then there's man and then there's all the subjects underneath, which women are somewhere along that way. that dilutes moral agency of humans. That God, when you talk about free will, and that God has given each one of us a moral decision making, and our vote is acting on that moral agency. When we don't vote, then we're not presenting our intentions and our moral agency into the conversation. In the same way a prayer is. A prayer offers our intention and offers our moral agency into a particular situation. And so I think that's really important about faith when you're talking about faith and politics, is that when we're not showing up and when we're not talking and when we're not voting, what we're doing is that is a suppression of our moral agency and our moral decision making. And I don't know how many conversations that I've had then with other candidates, but then about women in the House, they'll go and ask like, you need to talk to my husband to figure out, how I'm going to vote how my husband tells me to. I'm going to vote how my pastor tells me to. I'm going to vote how my uncle or my papa or somebody out there is telling them to. And I think when it comes to faith, is that we each are responsible to God for moral decision making, and that we can trust that God will equip us to make the best decision that we can. And it's one way to hold other Christians accountable is when we act on that moral agency. If we relegate that moral agency to other people, then it's a lot harder to hold other people accountable, because they know that they've just they're going to just take that on, and there's not a conversation. So part of iron sharpens iron is each one of us acting within the faith that God has given us to make a well-informed moral decision and moral agency. So I am a huge champion for moral agency. Even if I think that they made a mistake, I would rather that person make that decision using their own brain, their own heart, their own relationship with God, their own faith to come up with that decision, than relegating it off into, well, they told me to, and I'm going to be obedient and submissive, or whatever you want to say. But that has relegated their moral agency into an inferior place. And really, that's when you have children are hurt. There's all kinds of damages that happen in society when women or a group of people relegate their moral agency to some kind of caste system that can't be checked. Because every society that does that is that you have a lot of unnecessary human suffering when that happens. So my big takeaway is go act on your moral agency, because that is your moral responsibility that each person has, and do the best you can. And I'm here to listen and talk to you if that you think that's helpful. But whatever you do, do not just relegate that to somebody else's decision making.
Thank you so much, Senator Boren. So, final thoughts from Senator Boren: definitely utilize your moral agency, utilize your voice. And another takeaway I have from you, Senator Boren, is the ask questions. Ask those questions. I'm reminded of Ted Lasso: be curious, not judgmental. And I think we can all benefit from that mindset while we're doing advocacy. So thank you so much, Senator Boren. We do have a few minutes remaining, so I'd like to invite some final thoughts from our other two panelists real quick. Jayshana, what are some wrap-up thoughts you have?
Well, if I may, I would really like to bring Julius to this space, because when we are talking to our young adults and our marginalized communities, the lack of knowledge is detrimental. And so, using the word knowledge, Julius took knowledge and he said, know your ledge. If you understand and know the knowledge, and you understand who's running for office, you understand what policies are and what bills are being put into place, like, take the time, read, understand and know the policies that are governing us. Because if we go and we try to fight these things and we don't know, then what is our ledge? So our ledge is understanding and knowing what it is that we're coming into, what it is we're fighting for, and understanding and knowing the power that we have together collectively, coming together as one, regardless if it's conservative, progressive, wherever we're at. We all have something in common that will bring us together, that will help us fight and make change.
That's beautifully said. Thank you so much, Jayshana. Appreciate you. Lori, final thoughts?
I'd just like to encourage people to do something. I think right now a lot of people are feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of things that need to be fixed or corrected or um, totally reworked, and that can lead to frozen inaction. So I encourage people to pick one thing, choose one thing, and do what Jasana just said. No, knowledge. And then also find people to work with. Do not try to be a lone ranger. That's not real. That is not real. Find people to work with. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. People are already working. So join their work, support their work, amplify each other's voices, and change will come.
That's beautifully said. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for taking the time this evening to have this dialogue. I also want to thank all of the activity in the chat. Thank you for all of your comments. They're very powerful. Every vote does indeed matter. My ask is that at the very basic level, support the separation of church and state for all people of faith throughout the state of Oklahoma and sign our sign-on letter at okfaith.org/separation. When you do that, you will then be added to our advocacy listserv so that we will be sending emails out when there are things that threaten religious freedom. When faith is being weaponized in our state house, we will let you know. So please, if you feel the need to move right now, start there because we'd love to loop you in. Thank you all so much for joining us live. And if you're joining us after the fact, we thank you as well for your views and your support. Have a lovely evening.